Hi everybody, welcome to Clintondale Middle School. I'm here in room 111 trying to shoot a video about the chapter 18, which is about reform and revival. It's a really interesting chapter because we talked a lot about women's rights, ending slavery. We talked about prison reform. Bless you. We talked about education reform, and we've talked about different movements in American society. So here we go. Let's talk first about the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening is a religious movement that happened during the 1820s and 1830s. This is on your test. That's why I'm putting it on the review. But the Second Great Awakening taught people that they could get to heaven by being good and doing good works. That they didn't have to be chosen to go to heaven, that they could go to heaven by, like I said, doing good works. And one of the things that needed to be done was the reform in society. So the Second Great Awakening was important because people thought that it would help them get to heaven by helping change things in society. It inspired them. So the Second Great Awakening, people came out to churches and people came out to big tent revivals, and they heard from people like Reverend Finney that they could get to heaven by doing good works, and this inspired people to make changes. The most important change that I'm going to talk about in the chapter is abolition. And what abolition is the ending of slavery. So somebody who is an abolitionist believes that there should be an immediate end to slavery. So an abolitionist is somebody who wants to end slavery. Now, some people wanted the government to end slavery. Some people wanted the government to buy the slaves off the slave masters. Others who were more radical, now this is on the test, radical abolitionists wanted to sneak down into the South and give slaves guns and let the slaves free themselves. So radical abolitionists wanted slavery to end immediately by any means necessary. Okay. Many abolitionists, though, were writers in the North. A lot of these abolitionists had newspapers. For example, William Lloyd Garrison had a newspaper called The Liberator, and it was one of the most famous abolition newspapers. So everything that was in the newspaper called The Liberator was about ending slavery. Another famous person, I know that you know this is a famous person, his name is Frederick Douglass. I don't know if you know this, he had a newspaper called the North Star. And the North Star's motto was, right is of no sex and truth is of no color. And what that basically means is just because you're a white man doesn't necessarily make you right. That truth is truth, no matter what color you are, no matter what gender you are. So when he uses the word sex in this, he's talking about gender. Okay, so I just want to make that clear. So Frederick Douglass had a newspaper called the North Star. William Lloyd Garrison had a newspaper called The Liberator. Both of these are very important. Also, you had two sisters named the Grimke's. And Angelina and Sarah Grimke, they were famous because they wanted to give speeches, not only about women's rights, but about ending slavery. And a lot of things that we're going to learn about is how the women's rights movement grew out of these other reform movements. So I'm going to get back to that in a little bit later. But in those days, women did not speak out. And the Grimke sisters actually had a place set on fire. And they were speaking, and the men wanted them to stop speaking. So the men set the place on fire so they would stop. And they were throwing rocks at these women. It was just absolutely terrible. But they're famous because they stood up for themselves and they spoke out in public. So this is a really important thing, that the Grimke sisters were just saying, hey, it's our turn to speak. Don't tell us to be quiet. So I think the Grimke sisters are really, really important. Another very important reformer that you're going to be tested on tomorrow is Horace Mann. Now, Horace Mann is from Boston, and he is most famous for education reform. And Horace Mann is, before him, most kids didn't even go to school. Now, after Horace Mann and all of his reforms, a lot of kids did go to school, but most of those kids were white boys. Schools were not just inclusive for everybody, and not all schools included girls. and no schools included African Americans. So this reform by Horace Mann was great. It was a step in the right direction, but it wasn't exactly where we needed to be as far as education. Next thing I want to talk about is women's rights and how the women's rights movement kind of grew out of the abolition movement. Like, so many women were speaking out against slavery, and as they spoke out against slavery, they kind of realized they were slaves themselves. So the famous story I talked about in class, how Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton went to London, and they ended up behind the curtain because they couldn't be seen in the men's conference. And they ended up having the Seneca Falls Convention back at home, where at the Seneca Falls Convention, it was a women's rights convention where they made their own Declaration of Independence. Only they called it the Declaration, you know it, third hour, the Declaration of Sentiments. And the Declaration of Sentiments was like a Declaration of Independence only for women, and how the women were being held down by the men in society. And I just want to say that I'm shooting this video live right now in front of third hour, and I know how shocked many of you must be because it seems so quiet in the background, and I'm just like, that just goes to the effort that third hour's making to listen to this video and try to do their best to get this stuff written down. The Second Great Awakening was, part of this. The Transcendentalism and Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson were part of this change in reform movements. Seneca Falls was a big deal. I want you to study. On the back of the test, you're going to have what's called a chronology. And a chronology is just a fancy way of saying it's a timeline. So what they're going to want you to do, I'm going to hold it up here right now. I'm going to post this on Edmodo for you to look at tonight. So you're going to have an opportunity to look at the timeline tonight, not the questions, but the timeline. And it's just going to ask you basic questions about what happened in the timeline, and you're going to have to kind of read it. You're going to have to make an inference, and you're going to have to tell what the chronology suggests. It also talks in this chronology, and one of the questions has to do with Dr. Blackwell. So I would read about Dr. Blackwell. She's important, and I just want you to make sure that you read about her because she's on the test. As far as everything else, prison reform, Dorothea Dix, they were locking up mentally challenged people as criminals. That was a major problem. We've studied abolition. We studied Frederick Douglass, the Grimke sisters, Horace Mann and his attempts to make schools better. And without any further comment, I want you to watch this video. I want you to stop this video as many times as you need to improve your notes. And I want you to spend a good 45 minutes studying for this test. It's the first test of the 4th card marking. You are almost in 9th grade, and I want you to do a great job on this test. So without any further comment, God bless America.